We are all members of the British Art Network subgroup, British Women Artists, 1750 to 1950. And this is the period we're going to cover this evening, discussing the education and exhibiting opportunities for women artists. During our conversation, we're going to highlight women's achievements at prestigious art schools, how they often struggled to be part of major modern art movements, and how they had to wait for recognition at the Royal Academy of Arts. We're also going to discuss recent exhibitions and works on view during London Art Week online. Our conversation is going to last for about 40 minutes before 20 minutes of questions and answers. So if you'd like to, please do submit a question to us. That's in the question and answer box in the bottom right-hand corner. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce this evening's participants. Dr. Alicia Foster is an art historian, curator and novelist. She curated the first ever museum show to focus on Jessica Dismall's work, which opened in autumn 2019 at Pallant House Gallery. Radical Women, Jessica Dismall and Her Contemporaries. And I really recommend the wonderful book that Alicia wrote to accompany it. Dr. Katie Harrington is also another participant this evening, and she's an art historical researcher and curator. She has led British Women Artists 1750 to 1950, a University of York-based subgroup of the Tate British Art Specialist Network since 2015. Sacha Llewellyn is joining us from Paris, and she's an independent writer and exhibition curator and co-founder of Lis Llewellyn. She specialises in interwar British art with a particular focus on women, and in 2017, she was awarded the William Berger Prize for British Art History. Karen Taylor is also joining us this evening. She's a private dealer in British and topographical art with a particular interest in works of historic and geographical importance. She established Karen Taylor Fine Art in 1999, and for the last 5 years, she's been regularly exhibiting at fairs in London. And Karen has just published a catalogue on British women artists 1780 to 1890 and their works on paper for London Art Week Digital. So that's where I thought we could really start our conversation this evening by looking at the work which adorns the front cover of Karen's online catalogue. So perhaps we could just have a look at that first image. It's by Charlotte Bosanquet. And Karen, I really wanted to ask you about why you compiled this catalogue of drawings by some forgotten women artists and how you sought to find a voice for them. Perhaps you can tell us more about your work on the online catalogue and the provenance of this work, which I understand is from a friendship album.
Yes, that's right, Alice. Well, I've been planning a catalogue of the work of women artists for some time, and lockdown did provide me with a bit of space and no excuse not to actually get on and do it. And this particular drawing comes from a fascinating album assembled by someone called Augusta Raymond Barker, who lived at Fairford Park in Gloucestershire. And you can see her and her sister Leonora sitting in the drawing room at Fairford Park with its beautiful Chinese wallpaper, probably in their mid-teens. This drawing was actually done by her aunt, Charlotte Bosanquet. Her mother, Harriet Bosanquet, came from a family of Huguenot bankers. And Charlotte's life was very interesting in the sense that she fell on slightly hard times when her father died unexpectedly. And she led something of a peripatetic existence, traveling from one Bosanquet house to the other, sketching as she went. And clearly this is one that she did while she was actually at Fairford, staying with Augusta. So it provides a rather sort of good illustration of the lives of the kind of women who I'm particularly interested in. Most of them did do watercolours. It was a female accomplishment expected at the time. And the research into this album really led me into a fascinating journey through the lives of a lot of women from big houses in Gloucestershire, friends of Augusta's primarily, and also of the sisters of her stepmother. Her mother died, and her stepmother was someone called Lady Catherine Reynolds Morton, who lived at nearby Woodchester Park, which the National Trust is actually working at the moment, doing up the gardens there. And the four sisters were all accomplished draftswomen in their own right, and the album just contained a large number of very beautiful jewel-like drawings. Augusta had an eye for the small and the beautiful, and she was also very good at annotating, which was very lucky for me. So I knew who all the drawings were by, because that might have been slightly tricky otherwise, as a lot of them probably weren't stylistically that easy to identify. But she was a very meticulous cataloguer in that sense. So that was the beginning of my journey, really. The rest of the catalogue, serendipity really led to its compilation, because it's not so easy actually finding interesting work by women. You tend to come across them, and you know, they lead you on another sort of journey.
Well, maybe that's another journey we could just explore by looking at the next image, which is by Maggie Sumner, Karen. And I mean, I think the wonderful thing about the catalogue that you've put online is that actually, if you want to, people who are looking online now, Karen has actually got a video of the sketchbook and all the pages, which is really beautiful. And I think that idea of you uncovering things about these women artists is really interesting. I think in the catalogue you mentioned that you found an unpublished cachet of letters in the Cumbria Records Office between John Ruskin and Maggie Sumner. And I think that led you really on a journey about discovering more about her. You knew that she worked with Aubrey Beardsley on the Fourth Yellow Book, but maybe you could just briefly tell us a little bit about her and her art education.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, she lived at Kelbarrow, which is on Grasmere. Her father was the rector there. And that's not actually very far away from Brantwood, where Ruskin lived towards the end of his life. And she clearly enjoyed, you know, sort of country pursuits. And this little sketchbook was given to her sister Elizabeth in 1875. And it comprises about 27 or so beautiful, very detailed drawings in pencil. And she's then put them in this sketchbook very carefully and done the most lovely drawings of plants in pen and ink around the outside. She clearly did have a sort of an illustrator's eye. And I think that was what she wanted to be, judging from her conversations and her letters with Ruskin. The letters are very interesting. They show Ruskin not being quite as opposed to women artists as he is sometimes thought to be, given some of his pronouncements. And he was very, very encouraging and gave very constructive advice. He'd, you know, tell her to concentrate on light and shade, gave her advice about what he thought she ought to draw, mossy rocks, sky, birds, and also advised her to sort of work in colour the next day from memory, which I found quite interesting, having thought she should work in black and white. And they do appear to have met. I mean, there isn't evidence of sort of when and where, but between Oxford and Brantwood, I suspect that there probably were opportunities. But then the trail goes rather cold after the Yellow Book. I don't really know what happened to her. And so, you know, I'm hoping that I will be able to discover more over time, but the end of her life is something of a mystery just at the moment.
Well, Karen, who knows who's listening out there and might approach you about more information on her. Thank you, that's really interesting. I think, as I briefly mentioned in my introduction, we're all members of the British Art Network subgroup on British women artists. And I really wanted to turn to Katie Harrington now. In 2015, Katie, you initiated this network for researchers and curators who have expertise on the subject of historic women artists. It's funded by Tate and the Paul Mellon Centre. And I just wondered if you could briefly tell us a little bit about what motivated you to bring the group together.
Of course, yeah, I'd be happy to. So at the time, I was studying for my PhD at the University of York. I'd just kind of finished that. And I was really feeling that there didn't seem to be that many researchers and curators in the field that I could connect with. Some of the people who had published very good writings on women artists of the 19th century, which is my specialism, had then really moved on to work on other areas of research. So when I saw the call go out from BAN to propose specialist networks, I thought it was a perfect opportunity to reach out and actually determine, you know, how many researchers and curators are there in the UK who are interested in women artists from 1750 to 1950. And now we actually have 112 members of the group. What I sought to do really was map geographically where we're located, and I found that we stretch across the whole of the UK. I've even had inquiries from abroad to join the network. So, and it keeps growing over lockdown. Some more members have joined. So it really just shows that there is a lot of expertise in this area out there. And I think a key motivation to keep going with the subgroup and keep applying year on year for extended funding is that every time we meet, we feel that there's so much more to do in the field, and that we can achieve so much collectively and by sharing our knowledge. And that's really the key to moving things forward, is that sharing of knowledge. So yeah.
Thank you, Katie.
Hope that explains my motivation.
That's it. No, I think that really explains your motivations. And I think that idea of uncovering women artists that we're not familiar with, that we know very little about, but also looking at women artists who we know a great deal about. And I thought we could just start this evening's conversation by looking at Angelica Kaufman, who starts the kind of time period of the British Art Network subgroup. And I mean, I think this is an area that Karen and Katie, that you're both interested in, the early 18th century into the 19th century, when Kaufman is working. And we're looking at the moment of this wonderful self-portrait that's in the National Portrait Gallery. And I just thought that her art education is obviously interesting to look at. And then possibly just looking at her as a founder member of the Royal Academy. So I don't know if Karen would like to just briefly tell us a little bit about her.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, she's a sort of a poster girl, isn't she, for, you know, the kind of development of women artists. She was something of a child prodigy, and like many women artists of really the later part of the 19th century, she was the daughter of an artist, and so that really allowed her to be given what was effectively a private education. She travelled with her father, who was a muralist, and you know, she did a lot of copying in Italy, which I suppose is, you know, one of the greatest educations any artist can have. And copying remains, you know, a very sort of fundamental part of a traditional kind of artistic education. And, you know, famously, she was one of the first two women who were founder members of the RA. The other was Mary Moser, who was also the daughter of an artist as well, which, you know, there's something of a pattern there, I think, if one looks back over art history.
Well, perhaps we could just show, Karen, just for everyone watching at home and online, the Johann Zoffany, the academicians of the Royal Academy, where we can actually see Mary Moser and Angelica Kaufman. Sorry, that's one we're going to look at. We can look at, but it's the next one on actually from that. There we are. Thank you. Yes, I don't know, Katie, would you maybe like just to?
So the interesting thing here is that the two women who were founding members of the Royal Academy aren't in the room. They're actually on the wall, represented through portraits on the right-hand side there. And one of the things that this really illustrates is the fact that women artists weren't permitted to be part of the life room. They weren't permitted to be present during the study of the nude figure. And this was something that impacted on women artists' career up until that opportunity really opened up, because in order to be a fully professional artist, you needed that knowledge of the human body and of anatomy if you were going to focus on figure study. There's interesting differences there between Kaufman and Mary Moser, because of course Moser was best known for her flower paintings, was very, very successful in that area. So this really illustrates a central challenge for women artists in breaking through to be a professional artist, I feel.
And there's the sheer overwhelming number of men versus the women, isn't there? I mean, it's quite astonishing when you look at this picture, the kind of massive imbalance.
Well, Alicia, I think that leads on really nicely to maybe just discussing your Tate Women Artists book that you worked on. It's certainly my Bible. I'm sure it's a lot of ours who's joined this conversation this evening. Even when I was talking to Karen the other evening, I actually grabbed the book and we were talking about one of the artists that was in there. So I don't know if you could just talk to us a little bit about how that came about. I mean, in that book, which obviously focuses on Tate's collection, you discuss the professional education of women artists. And I wonder if you can just say a little bit about why or when you think art education really opens up to women, and is it on the same terms as men? Maybe we could just look at the Nellie Joshua image just as a kind of starting point.
So this is Heatherley's art school in 1900, around 1900, and what Karen said is quite right, that in the 17th century, early 18th century, mainly if you wanted to be a professional artist, you would have to be part of an artistic family. You would be trained by your father or your brother, and that's, you know, there were very few opportunities to get any kind of professional training outside a kind of artistic studio that you were already connected to. What happens through the later 18th century is that art becomes an attractive and acceptable pastime for ladies of the middle and upper classes, and so even really great names of the day, people like Turner, earned a side kind of income by tutoring ladies of great families. By the time we've got to the mid-19th century, you've kind of got modernization, you've got industrialization, urbanization, the kind of slightly more kind of fluidity in terms of moving around and kind of access to city life, and galleries opening, museums opening. So then you have the foundation of Heatherley's in 1845, which is founded by a group of students, I believe, and is open to men and women on the same terms, including the life room, which is, you know, as Karen said, to be a professional artist at this period, you have to have studied from the life room, and keeping women out of the life room is effectively a way of stopping them becoming professionals, keeping them in the amateur zone. So you've got Heatherley's, and then in the 1860, finally, we have a woman student who enters the Royal Academy, and this is Laura Herford, and she only gets in because she puts her initials down rather than a full name. And once she's been accepted, she's an astonishing woman, isn't she? One of those, again, I think, who don't know an awful lot about. Once she's in, it's impossible to keep them out. So by the time she dies in 1870, there are 40 women training at the Royal Academy. And around that time, also 1871, you have the Slade opening at University College London, and University College London is founded as a kind of very inclusive, liberal, radical university. It doesn't divide its students or exclude students because of their religious affiliations, and so women enter the Slade. And what you have is this kind of increasingly large number of women who want a serious professional art education. Once they're allowed, you know, to train as artists, they want more. And so the Slade opens, again, the life room. It's similar but different. So the women at the Slade, even in the 1890s when Gwen John is a student, they have a separate life room in the basement. And from the work that I've seen in the Tate, in the UCL art collection, the women, when they draw from the male life model, he's got a kind of very discreet loincloth attached to him. So there's a sense, again, that the kind of, it's equal but different. So it's not really actually equal. They're seen as separate. They're seen as a different kind of group. But then, of course, once they're allowed in, I mean, by the time Gwen John studies at the Slade in the 1890s, 2/3 of the student are women. So there's a real hunger for art education, but how that translates into professional opportunities, making professional careers, is another story, of course. It's a much slower story, full of, there's progress, but there are setbacks. We'll come on to this a bit later, I think.
And also that idea of exhibiting, you know, art is actually being shown.
Yeah.
And this work by Nellie Joshua, Sasha, you showed it in your exhibition, 50 works by 50 British women artists, 1900 to 1950, which was shown in Leeds and before that in London. I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit, because I mean, it's such a wonderful title for an exhibition and the catalogue was brilliant, but perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about how the exhibition came about and what you really sought to explore through it.
Yeah, so here's the front cover, 50/50. It opened in London in December 2018, and toured to Leeds University in 2019. So it was part of the celebrations of an important anniversary, the Representation of the People's Act centenary, which gave all women over the age of 30 the right to vote. So I selected 50 works by 50 women artists, 1900 to 1950. So 50 artists, 50 works, 50 years, but also 50-50 could be read as 50% of the story that's never been told. Basically, a vision of 20th century art which had the 50-50 balance would be a much truer representation of British art than we have. So when I was putting the exhibition together, people would say, oh, but you'll never find 50 artists working in that period. That's impossible. Actually, I could have done the exhibition with 50 different artists, and that 10 or maybe even 20 times over. So the aim of the exhibition wasn't to produce a survey. Surveys are really difficult because people judge you or judge the survey on who's left out, not who's in. And people expect to see works by the artists that they know. So who are the big names that people might know of women artists? Well, Laura Knight, Vanessa Bell, Barbara Hepworth. And that reinforces this idea that there just aren't any other women worth looking at. So I put pictures in there that were also by well-known women, but also a lot of names of a lot of women artists that have been all but forgotten. And I think visitors to the show were really surprised that far from being creators of sentimental and cliched pictures of flowers and children, actually women artists engaged with the full range of contemporary issues. But there was so much research to be done, because the fact is, as it's already been brought up today, there's so little women's archival material left because it's so often destroyed, unlike men's archival material, which is often hung on to by families. And I think we really have to remember that revealing the work of women artists isn't just a matter of rounding up a few lost heroines. It's about reclaiming their historical presences and as accurately as possible documenting their output.
Thank you, Sasha. I mean, that exhibition that toured to Leeds was wonderful, and we actually had a subgroup meeting up in Leeds. Katie, you were the curator for the Stanley and Audrey Burton Gallery at this time, and I know that a lot of your research has highlighted pre-Raphaelite women artists, and there was obviously the wonderful pre-Raphaelite Sisters exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery, which was curated by Jan Marsh. And I just wondered if we could just look at a few women artists now of this period. I think the first one we were going to look at was Maurice Bartoli Stillman, Cloister Lilies, which she had the exhibition at the Watts Gallery recently. So there's this resurgence of exhibitions focusing just on women artists. But Katie, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about her and about the two other women that we were going to touch on.
Yeah, just going to say that absolutely NPG show introduced a real array of female protagonists who played key roles in the pre-Raphaelite story. It's just fantastic to see that this group of women are starting to get the recognition that they deserve. But picking up on what Sasha said, there's still so many more out there than the ones that we're able to put into an exhibition. I'm sure that show could have been done with many more women artists relating to the pre-Raphaelite story. But just to talk a little bit about Stillman. So Stillman had an extensive exhibiting career both in the UK and also exhibited in the United States and sold works in the UK and States. There seems to be the theme also in that she gained her art education first through having permission from her parents to study more as an accomplishment, but managing to hook Ford Madox Brown as her tutor, so very established artist who was associated with the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. So she then became involved with that group. In fact, Rossetti, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, wanted to befriend her because she was so beautiful that he wanted to paint her, famously said to Ford Madox Brown, box her up and bring her to me, because he was keen to paint her. So interesting ways in which women gained access as models into that circle, but also gained arts education through relationships with those prominent male figures. So Stillman spent a lot of time abroad in Italy, and that's really reflected particularly in this work, Close to Lilies, which is based on Santa Croce in Florence. But what's really fascinating about her work is that she had a lot of knowledge of the architecture of Italy, and a really imaginative way of representing it. So she represents those spaces that she experienced personally in her arts, and I think that is something that could be afforded a lot more research in terms of women's work, to think about how their experiences of travel really impacted on them.
We've flicked on Katie's.
You've moved on, yeah. That's right. Joanna Mary Boyce Wells is perhaps one of the earliest women associated with the Pre-Raphaelite movement. So she produced this lone female study of Elgiva, and this was even before Rossetti really started to exhibit his lone female figures. So she was really at the cutting edge of the relationship between Pre-Raphaelite and aestheticism at the time, thinking then about moving to these very blocky colours and focusing on close-ups of lone female figures. But that's something that she's not really been known for until she'd begun to be studied more, and her work has then been exhibited, and then we can see those correlations there, and that in many cases women artists were actually producing these kinds of works and liaising with their male peers, and then the male peers exhibiting those kind of showstoppers. Ruskin actually commented on this work and really praised her for it. So it's interesting how the study of these women artists can shed light on their male peers as well, as Karen was saying about how the letters that she discovered show a different side of Ruskin. The same may be said about the relationship between Joanna and Ruskin, or Joanna and Rossetti. We actually get a much deeper understanding of art of any given period if we're looking at that relationship between women artists and their male peers, rather than just focusing on those male peers' works that we know very well already.
And I think, I mean, her work to me was some of the highlights of the Pre-Raphaelite Sisters exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery, particularly those images that focus on her children. And I think, you know, this is for lots of women, they painted what was in their homes, what was familiar to them, and they are exceptionally beautiful works. The next image that I think we were going to have a look at was looking at Evelyn de Morgan, and I think she again is an interesting woman. She's trained at the Slade. Alicia, you mentioned the Slade School of Art, which is just such an important breeding ground for these incredible women artists. But this is a work, Karen, that you're actually showing online as part of London Art Week. I don't know if you'd like to just talk to us a little bit about her and about this this beautiful study of a girl.
Well, picking up on what Katie said about women travelling, I think what's very clear from this drawing is her great love and the impact that the work of Botticelli and the Quattrocento in Florence had on Evelyn de Morgan's work. She went to Florence quite often to stay with her uncle, Spencer Stanhope, who lived there. She was lucky she came from, you know, a fairly well-to-do family and was able to travel. And the beautiful delicacy of this drawing, which really appealed to me, I think, you know, sums that up beautifully. I thought her work in the Pre-Raphaelite Sisters was incredibly powerful, actually. And for me, she was actually possibly the star, because the impact of that massive kind of picture at the end when you walked into that last room was really very striking, wasn't it? Yes, I mean, it's a lovely, delicate Pre-Raphaelite drawing. It shows you just what a good practitioner she was.
And actually a woman artist that you're showing, which is the next image, which is by Alice Chambers, who is an artist I've never heard of, but was a direct contemporary of Evelyn de Morgan. And you said that you've had lots of interest about, learning more about her as part of London Art Week, Karen.
Yes, I mean, this drawing very clearly shows the influence of Burne-Jones, doesn't it? And if you look at her monogram in the lower corner, you can see that's quite reminiscent of Rossetti's. So she clearly was, absolutely sort of picked up a lot of the kind of influences from the major Pre-Raphaelites. She was the daughter of a rector, a vicar from Essex. She was born in Harlow, and he was an Anglo-Catholic. And then her parents separated when she was quite young, and she actually seems to have received her earliest education somewhere called the Sydenham School for Girls, which was run by her mother's family. I don't know where she studied, where she went to art school. I'm sure that's something which will emerge with a bit of luck. But by 1881, she was living in Red Lion Square in the house that had been lived in first by Rossetti and then later by William de Morgan and Burne-Jones. And she's listed in the census as an artist. So, she's very much arrived and on the map. And she clearly seems to have known the Pre-Raphaelites and Whistler. And she's particularly associated with Charles Augustus Howell, who worked as Ruskin's secretary for a while. He's perhaps most famous for fishing out a manuscript copy of poems from Lizzie Siddle's coffin, a rather sort of terrible story. And she was clearly very close to him. And when he died, he named her as one of the executors of his will and a co-trustee and guardian of his daughter. And she exhibited in a number of different places. I think 9 works at the Royal Academy. You find her work exhibited in Birmingham, in Liverpool, in various watercolour societies. So she was out there. She specialised in sort of mythological subjects, in drawings of women in particular. And clearly there is more to learn about her. But we know a fair bit. And with a bit of luck, more will emerge as time goes by, as with so many of the other artists we've been discussing.
Wonderful, Karen. Well, it's an exceptional work. Alicia, you mentioned earlier Gwen John. I think a name that so many people listening this evening will know, and an exceptional self-portrait here. I mean, it's a work that I go back to in the National Portrait Gallery time and again. I love it. Just look at her gaze.
And it's actually very surprising when you see how small it is compared to the impact it has.
It's not much bigger than what that I'm looking at on my screen. Of course, Gwen John has had a show with Augustus John a number of years ago at Tate, another catalogue that I look at time and again. You wrote a book on Gwen John as part of the Tate series. She's also currently the subject of a focus display at Tate Britain when that reopens. You mentioned about at the Slade when she goes there in the 1890s, 2/3 of the students are women.
It's astonishing, yeah.
It's incredible. And then of course she goes to Paris to continue her art education. Yeah. So I just wondered if you could just highlight, the training at the Slade, and then why as a woman artist she might want to go to Paris to learn more.
So she I think her dates at the Slade are mid 1890s, the late 1890s, around 1895 to 1898. And it's a student cohort full of women, and very gifted women. And then, as many modernist or would-be modernist artists did, she moves to Paris, where there are the ateliers which are open, and you can just go and pay your fee and draw from the model. And this is seen as the next step for any aspirant young artist at that time. And she first goes in the late 1890s, just before I think this painting is made, and she studies at Whistler's Academy, Carmen, his short-lived art school. And I think locating that in this painting in relation to that really makes sense. If you think of Worcester's very close-toned, crepuscular paintings, and this painting, as usual, a screen image doesn't do it justice. The in massively nuanced sense of tone in this painting is just a wonder, isn't it, when you see it? And you return again and again, not only for her presence, but also for the stunning painting in this work. And this is a woman artist, a young woman artist, making absolutely an assertive statement of her presence, isn't it? I mean, this is not the Gwen John that we're often told about, the recluse. This is a woman who's making a statement. She's borrowing from the kind of repertoire, not only from kind of her contemporaries like Sargent and those wonderful paintings of women with the, you know, the leg of mutton sleeves, but also the whole kind of legacy of artist self-portraits from Reynolds to Rembrandt. And paintings of, you know, these paintings in which kind of the assertion of confident presence is really important. And she's almost like kind of playing with this mode of representation, because there's a painting in the Tate a couple of years later where it's a very different kind of statement of self. It's very kind of interior, concentrated. It borrows from kind of 19th century versions of femininity. It's very kind of restrained and quiet. But here is someone who is actually really kind of using her art education to explore what it could be to be an artist and a woman artist, and how you might represent that new kind of identity. So she goes to France, she trains, she goes with a group of women friends to start with, and then she goes back on her own, and she lives most of the rest of her life there. Now, you mentioned Augustus, Alice, and Augustus is quite important in this. I mean, Augustus, her brother, he's a younger brother, but he is allowed to go to the Slade before her. It's only when he's allowed to go and he survives for a year that she is then allowed to go as well. And that must be massively frustrating, I would have thought, you know, for a young woman who wanted to be an artist. So she goes there, and immediately he has a very, they're beautiful, the beautiful drawings, very kind of that reworking of Renaissance drawing, that very kind of fluid, very heroic almost, and idealized drawing style that he has. And he becomes immediately very, very famous, very young. And he's lionized in the London art world, not only because of his fantastically, he's a fantastically gifted artist, but also because he almost inhabits, he's the bohemian par excellence. He's got the big black hat, the earrings, the harem of women. And so she has one show with him in 1903 at the Carfax Galleries, and she shows 3 works, and he shows 45. And even then she removes one of them just before the exhibition opens. And then immediately afterwards, she moves to Paris. And I think part of that is this idea of kind of escaping from this looming presence and building a life in which her own artistic identity is first and foremost. She's not anybody's sister. And when she's in Paris, she shows at the salons. She becomes famously the model, a model for Auguste Rodin, who she shows her drawings and paintings to. And he says she's une belle artiste, a fine artist. And she becomes well known, and so much so that, you know, the collector, the noted American collector of modernism, John Quinn, goes to Paris partly to meet her, and buys more or less anything she'll let him have. So she builds this very, very successful career, even though, you know, from the early days of that kind of Slade training, the men are kind of, their work is valorized more than the women's. So there's a very early book about the Slade students published. They kind of realized there was this golden generation. People like Gwen and Augustus John and their contemporaries were this kind of golden generation. Women are a very marginal presence in that book, and I think that book's published around 1902.
I think it's by John Fothergill, is it? I think, is it John Fothergill who published
That's right, that's right. And she kind of escapes from that and creates this kind of artistic life. Again, she isn't given she has one solo show in her life in 1926 at the New Chenille Galleries. That's opposed to kind of Augustus's many, 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 many exhibitions. And I think, coming back to something that Sasha said, which I think is really important, is not just a matter of the representation of women in art exhibitions and in art collections. It's about the perception of their work afterwards. That's so important. And Sasha, you said about this kind of preconception when you were curating your show of the fact that, oh, well, it's women, so they're going to be painting this. Well, this idea that I think is dogs women often. So in Gwen John's case, the fact that she paints interiors was seen as for a long time, was led to interpretation of her work as a kind of symptom of her personal shyness. When she's working in an art world in which the interior is painted by Vuillard, by Bonnard, by Matisse, it's a really important subject matter in modernism. But for Gwen John, it can only ever be a symptom of her inner self and cut off from the art world. And I think it's changing the perception of women artists' work as much as doing the initial research into who they were and what they did that is incredibly important moving forward.
Well, I think that leads really nicely, Alicia, on to looking at Annie Swinnerton. She's the first woman who becomes an associate of the Royal Academy after Mary Mason and Kaufman are founder members. She becomes an ARA in 1922. Talking about exhibitions and the lack of exhibitions on women artists, that's being readdressed now. Katie, you worked on an Annie Swinnerton show at Manchester. She trained at Manchester. Again, she also went out to Paris. She went to the Académie Julian. And I just think it's about those challenges about not being able to paint from the life model. I don't know if you could tell us a little bit about that. I mean, we're looking at the Swinnerton work now, and then we can look at a wonderful photograph in a little while.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was the one elusive artwork that was actually already taken for an exhibition in America. I really wanted it to be in the show at Manchester, but was not to be. But I think it really just shows what a powerful knowledge and skills she had in the depiction of female figures, which is what she's really most known for, even though she was also a landscapist and portraitist. But the first thing to know about Swinnerton is actually the peak of her career and her exhibits at the Royal Academy and at the Grossing Gallery in London. New Gallery was really in the 1890s. She was particularly well known, and she probably produced some of her most impressive works in that period. But she, as you rightly said, Alice, she wasn't made ARA until 1922. She was also actually nominated 3 times before that, as early as 1914. So that demonstrates really the resistance to admitting women as even associate members. So I think Swinnerton is an excellent example that women artists were there working and exhibiting, but not receiving entry as members of exhibiting societies.
Well, maybe we could just look at the photograph that's the next image on. I mean, this shows you how many women artists, here we are, are training at the Académie Julian from a posed life model. You talk about Swinnerton and her looking, her training in Paris. But what I really wanted to look at was the next image, which is actually in London, which Sasha, you included in your catalogue, the 50/50 catalogue, with this image by Jean Wheelhouse of the Royal College of Life drawing room on the right, and then this wonderful photograph, which you kindly sent me from Sketch, on the left. And it was just about, really what I wanted to ask you was about the access to the life room, and how you felt that led to the progression of women artists during this kind of period of the early 20th century.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've touched already on the importance of the life room, but you're right to ask the question, why was it so important? And that's because it was not just deemed an ennobling subject, which goes back to classical times, but it was also essential for the creation of multi-figure compositions. And multi-figure compositions was the most highly esteemed work of art that you could create in an art school. First of all called history painting, and then from about 1911 decorative painting. And all the most prestigious prizes were reserved for these large scale multi-figure compositions. And so without access to the life room, women couldn't participate in these kind of competitions. And having separate life rooms or studying in separate spaces from men, that was their only opportunity to compete again alongside their male contemporaries. So we've looked at Heatherley's School of Art, and the Slade, right from its foundation, 1871, admitted women to the life room. And you had to wait for another 22 years, 1893, before women were admitted to the life room at the Royal Academy. So that immediately, as Alicia said, probably purposefully put them at a huge disadvantage. There's a wonderful quote I love from Virginia Woolf, where she said, which maybe explains as well a bit about the resistance. She said it was generally considered that for a woman to look upon nakedness with the eye of an artist and not simply with the eye of a mother, wife or mistress was corruptive of her innocence and destructive of her domesticity.
Brilliant, thank you, Sasha. Sasha, I think there are artists that, and there are so many women artists out there who deserve more light to be shone on them, but one that's particularly close to your heart is Winifred Knight's. And it wasn't really until 2016, and her show at Dulwich, I think, is the next image. This incredible image, The Deluge. I'm sorry, the words aren't coming up. This actually won her a scholarship to the British School at Rome, the first woman to win that scholarship. And Sasha, you've done a lot of work on her, and you've really shone a light on her career at the Slade and at the British School at Rome. And I just wondered if you could just, maybe just for people listening, tell us a little bit more about her.
Well, she's a really surprising case, the fact that she'd fallen into obscurity, because not only was she a hugely successful student at the Slade, she won every prize out there, as well as winning the prestigious summer competition, composition competition, and the Slade Scholarship. And then in 1920 became the first woman to win the Rome Scholarship, which was the most prestigious prize available to any British art student. And it was worth a huge sum of £250 a year, 3-year sojourn in Rome. She was adored by the critics. Her work was collected by some of the greatest collectors of her age, the Earl of Crawford, D.Y. Cameron, Sir Stephen Courtauld. And yet, after her early death, 1947, she suffered the same fate as so many female artists and completely disappeared from view. And I think until the 2016 show at Dulwich Picture Gallery, if most people hadn't heard of her, but if they had, they knew her by this one amazing painting that she won the prize, the Rome Scholarship Prize with, called The Deluge, 1920, which was deaccessioned by the British School at Rome and purchased by Tate in 1989. And I think it's not so much a case of all these women being written out of history, it's more a case that they've never been written into it. We have to remember that most of those writing reviews or books about art have largely been men writing for men. And even today, Winifred Knight's only entry in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography is as Sir Thomas Monington's first wife.
Gosh, so interesting, Sasha. I mean, we're talking about women that maybe haven't been so well known, but actually one that possibly is, if you ask people, name a woman artist, a British women artist, they might say Laura Knight. So we're just going to have a look at an image which I think is wonderful, which is the next image on, which is actually signed Laura Johnson, because of course her maiden name was Laura Johnson, and she marries Harold Knight, I think in about 1903. And I think this work is just an exceptional study of a young girl. We talked about Annie Swinnerton and her becoming an associate of the Royal Academy, but it wasn't until 1936 when Knight becomes a Royal Academician, so the first woman artist elected then. And I think this is an exceptional work. I don't know if anyone's got any thoughts about this and possibly the next work that we're going to have a look at.
It's really interesting. It's beautiful. I've never seen it before, and it's a real joy to see it. No, just wonderful. But what's interesting about it is it shows something about getting into the Royal Academy and what it took. The problem for a lot of women of actually being accepted into the Royal Academy was that they were expected to do, as part of their entrance portfolio, to be au fait with this kind of very, very, very skilled kind of stipple technique, that you had to have significant amounts of art training to even do that before you had an entrance portfolio. So Laura Herford, who gets into the Academy in 1860, is the first woman to be allowed in, has previously trained at Heatherley's for a while, so she's had access to art training first. And there's a kind of these barriers of you've got to have art training before you can have art training. You know, this is a kind of almost like example of just how skilled you have to be. And it's also interesting because, I mean, Laura Knight, the first show in 50 years was quite recently, wasn't it, at the National Portrait Gallery?
There was the Portraits exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery.
Yeah, and I think that was the first ever show of a woman artist at the Portrait Gallery.
Gosh.
I believe that's the case, and that's astonishing.
And there's going to be a show down at Penlee next year, which has been postponed because of COVID-19, but in next year, 2021, I was very fortunate to contribute to the catalogue that's just been published by Sampson & Co. But Alicia, you say about being locked out, so not being able to draw from the life model, but the next image we're showing is the wonderful portraits, self-portrait and portrait of Ella Napper, by night, which is again at the National Portrait Gallery. And this, I think, shows, well, their escape to Cornwall, which is very well documented, but she trained at the Nottingham School of Art with who became her husband, Harold Knight, and she wasn't allowed to study from the life model. Yet she goes down to Cornwall, and here it is, it's so wonderful when you look at this work. It's large, it's almost life-size, and here is her showing herself as a painter of the nude. It's just such a statement of 1913, just before the outbreak of the the First World War. I mean, I think we could talk a lot about Knight, and obviously there's going to be the celebration of her work down at Penlee in Cornwall next year, but we're running out of time as usual. I knew we could speak all night about this.
We also mentioned as well that you published a book on her, haven't you, as part of
I did down books, yes, didn't you, Alice?
I have, yes. So that's very kind of you to say, Sasha. So Eider Down Books, which is a new publishing house, Harriet Alston, she invited 5 women to write on 5 women artists. So it's modern women artists, it's called, and Laura Knight, Marlowe Moss, Frances Hodgkins, Lee Miller, and there's going to be a wonderful film about Lee Miller soon, and Sylvia Pankhurst by Katie Norris. And I understand there's going to be one next year on Eileen Agar, which that's wonderful. So these books are designed to really just an introduction and to kind of get a love of these women artists. So that's something to look out for. But I think what we were also discussing was about women artists and an engagement with modernism and modernist art movements. I mean, I think Laura Knight is a very modern woman artist. She engages with contemporary life. Of course, she's great friends with Alfred Munnings, which doesn't do her any favours at that time. But Alicia, you curated the exhibition Radical Women, which looked at Jessica Dismore and her contemporaries at Pallant House last year. And I know we're very short of time, but I just wanted to look at the next image, which I think uncovers so much about Dismore. Towards the end of her life, this is 1930s.
Yeah, it's 2 years before the end of her life. And she was an artist that moved through different phases in her practice, from figuration to abstraction, back to figuration, back to abstraction. She is almost like, she epitomizes the kind of modern artist journey. I mean, to refer back to Virginia Woolf, Woolf famously said, didn't she, in 1929, that for a woman to write fiction, she needed 500 a year in a room of her own. We could equally apply that to being an artist, actually. Professional opportunities were largely open only to women who had the money to afford to pay for the training. And Dismore comes from a very wealthy family who are also quite enlightened in terms of the education of their daughters, so they pay for her to go for the Slade. And then she has an allowance every year, which means she's freed from the necessity. Unlike Laura Knight, actually, Laura Knight always has to earn her own living, but Dismore doesn't actually. And this gives her the freedom to kind of take risks, to be radical in her work, to explore. She moves in and out of different artist groups, some of whom are more accommodating to women, some of whom are less. So, for example, Rhythm in the 1910s is known of being almost equal in its representation of male and female artists. Although, as we've talked about this evening, the women artists who are members tend to have fallen out of art history, whereas the male figures like Peploe, like J.D. Ferguson, are still very famous names. So part of my job at Radical Women was to bring those women back from the stores, from the private collections, and kind of look at what the conversation was between their works, the kind of conversation that gallery visitors would have seen at the time that the works were being made. So she moves in and out of different artist groups, but then, as is the case with so many women, and we've talked about this evening as well, she falls out of art history largely. So she dies in 1939, just before the outbreak of war, which is a terrible time to die, because your work is then, there's no opportunity for retrospectives, for kind of surveys, for any kind of no kind of opportunity to shore up your reputation. And by the time the war's over, the work's been it's all been dispersed, and the interest isn't there. So the Pallant House show was the first show actually in 80 years, first major show of her work, and also the first ever museum show, which again is what Sasha said. These women were often present in the art world, but then don't make it into the pages of art history. And this was an artist who, at the time she was working, when she had her only solo exhibition in 1926, a reviewer in the Sunday Times said that this show should be seen by everyone interested in modern art. And yet she disappears. So, I mean, it's quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, we're all working in this area in which there's a constant sense of how much there still needs to be done to even kind of uncover who was actually there, let alone do the interpretative work and the kind of curatorial work.
Well, I think Alicia just leads us really nicely onto the last image that we're showing, which is by Leonora Carrington. And Sasha, that idea of actually putting women back in the picture. Sadly, the Dulwich show, the British Surrealism exhibition, is currently closed, but I know that you wrote the chapter in the exhibition catalogue on women surrealists, and Leonora Carrington, wonderful image that we're looking at now. I don't know if you just like to very quickly touch on that work that you've been doing about women surrealists.
Well, the male-dominated politics of the surrealist group in Britain is really shocking. Hardly any women were included, and most of those that did manage to join were then shoved out about a year later, like Ethel Cahoon, because she had too much interest in the occult. It's like, hello, occult surrealism. It's just absolutely appalling. So many of them had to work on the periphery of the surrealist group. And so, because they were never part of the group and exhibiting with the group, they've just been forgotten again by history. But there has been a lot of interest recently in the women surrealists. And it's interesting, at the Dulwich show, I was reading the reviews of it, and so many of the critics picked out the women surrealists as producing by far the most interesting work. But of course, their role within surrealism was so ambivalent, because on the one hand, they were attracted to it because it promised social and sexual freedom from sort of bourgeois culture. On the other hand, they were sort of scooped up in a narcissistic sort of dream state of traditional male desires. And so a lot of their work really is bringing, focusing on women's conditions. So women as Mother Earth, women as a witch, not women as a sexual object or femme fatale or femme enfant like the male artists were focusing on. So really interesting group, and lots of them again then exhibiting and talked of as surrealist at the time, but had totally disappeared from view. Only 5 women surrealists were in the Dulwich show, British surrealists, and obviously Carrington, one of the highlights.
Thank you, Sasha. We've got a couple of questions come in. I mean, I think actually one that someone's just flagged here is about if there's an accessible online database of women artists, and they've asked about an international one rather than just British. But I just wondered if anyone had any good ideas about where people could look if they're interested in finding out more.
I don't know about an international database, but Art UK has some very good. I mean, I do some writing for them, so I'm going to say this, but some very good pieces by, I think, Sasha, you've written for them as well, has a very good kind of database of what's in British collections, and they're constantly building it and digitizing the works, and also commissioning pieces of new research on the works on Art UK. So that's a good place to start.
Art UK is really wonderful because so many women's works have been confined to the attics or cellars of museums.
Or provincial museums where they're not seen because they weren't seen as important enough. Yeah.
And this is bringing so many women artists that I certainly never heard of to the fore.
Yeah.
So definitely a website, really highly recommended.
Well, thank you everyone. I've just got another one come in about does anyone address the lack of representation of women artists in national collections? I guess that's actually something that you did, Alicia, with your Tate Women's book, and I think there's a lot more.
That book I started working on in around 2000 after I'd done the Tate, the Gwen John book, and they said that I could write a book about anything to do with women artists, so I could choose my favourites or I could look at a particular period. But I thought actually to make it kind of useful, but also to do some research that I felt was kind of valid, I would look at women artists in that particular collection and actually do some basic research which hadn't been done on what was actually there. Many of the works had disappeared into the stores, weren't part of the kind of narratives that were on display in the Tate galleries. So, and what I found out was actually, what shocked me, astonished me actually, and I've been working in the field for about 20 years by then, and it was that kind of out of 3 out of 2, there were, in the Tate collection itself, there were 2,600 male artists and only 316 women. So women made up 11% of the artists, and their work was only 7% of the collections. And that was 100 years after the Tate had been founded, 100 years after that generation of Gwen John and 2/3 of the women at the Slade being women. Now, it just absolutely astonished me. So I was anxious to kind of bring the well-known artists, put them in the kind of context of the women who had disappeared, and show them both. And you can do that in a book in a way that you can't necessarily do on the gallery wall. You can create a kind of coherent narrative in a way that you can't when you're making a display often. And so that was the kind of thinking behind that. But it certainly shocked me. I mean, I was really surprised to see the figures.
Well, I think there's just so much more for us all to do. And I think I'd urge anyone who's out there who's interested in the period that we've had under discussion, British women artists, to join the subgroup, to get in contact with Katie Carrington. And I know there's going to be some online conversations hopefully happening over the course of this summer, although that seems to be fast disappearing. Anyway, it just really leaves me to say thank you very much for all of you joining us online. Thank you to Rachel Elwes of Ben Elwes Fine Art for inviting me to host and to lead this conversation this evening. And really thank you very much for all our panelists, to Katie, Karen, Alicia and Sasha in Paris. Thank you very much. It's been a really enjoyable one. It's just flown by. But before we go, I just want to say that London Art Week online continues until this Saturday, the 10th of July. Each morning you can join breakfast with the National Gallery, and the one this morning was fantastic. And tomorrow afternoon, there's the art world's latest merger, the symbiosis of private and public sales. So that just leaves me to say thank you very much. And thank you to Pauline, who's been very kindly doing our slide deck. Have a lovely evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.